Welcome to the COSME Astrology Podcast. I am your astrologer and host, Lisa Warman. In today's episode, episode 12, I'm sitting with astrologer Gray Crawford. Gray and I deep dive into the Venus Retrograde in Aries. During this episode, you will receive insight on what a Venus retrograde is, how it plays out in Aries, how you can use this retrograde for your personal life, and also how you can use this retrograde to embrace your creativity in order to strip down what no longer serves you and bring in your true creative nature and authenticity. As always, the COSME Astrology Podcast is recorded with a live studio audience. The intention of the podcast is to create community around astrology. There's so much empowerment, education, and unforgettable moments that come through when we're all in person. All right, so go ahead and sit back, relax, grab your journal, and enjoy the show. Welcome to the COSME Astrology Podcast. I am your astrologer and host, Lisa Warman, and today I am sitting here with guest astrologer Gray Crawford. Gray, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. It is episode 12. We are going to be discussing the Venus retrograde in Aries and also Pisces. And I'm just excited to have you on the show. So you came from Washington, right?
Yeah, I live in Olympia, Washington, which is sort of in between Seattle and Portland, down at the bottom of the Salish Sea in Washington State. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. My wife's a goldsmith and silversmith, so also we're coming for the big gem shows here, but exciting, that I also get to do this show here with you.
It's awesome.
Talk about Venus retrograde. It's a really extremely powerful time the next few months. Mm-hmm. So there's definitely a lot to talk about.
Absolutely. So yes, thank you for being here. First time on the show. And why don't you just tell the guests a little bit about yourself, about your practice, and when you got started?
Yeah, so I guess I've been into astrology for a long time. Kind of the late 90s is when I first got into astrology. And I've been practicing doing readings since maybe roughly 2008. And I'm a full-time professional astrologer at this time. Mostly do natal consultations, and I also do horary, which is when you ask a question and you cast a chart to answer the question for somebody, not unlike tarot divination, but using astrology. And I also do a lot of writing and teaching and classes and that sort of thing.
Awesome. Where are you teaching? Just your own practice?
Yeah,
okay.
Well, I do teach courses, and my website, graycrawford.net, you can find out information there. I actually have a course that's going to start at the end of February called Triton's Cave, which is actually going to be about what we're talking about here, which is sort of how to deal with the Saturn-Neptune cycle and the Venus retrograde and all the big changes going on in the world, and a way to work with it more creatively and imaginatively. I also teach for Kepler College, which is an online astrology school. But then I also have my own Patreon, and if you go to my site, I have courses periodically, so you can always find out about what's going on that way.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're excited to dive into the Venus retrograde with you today. And I know we're talking a little bit before the show. There's a lot happening and a lot going on in the next couple months. And it definitely all ties in together. So before we start, just for the audience, we have a lot of astrologers in the audience and a lot of astrologers who listen to the show. Also, we have students of astrology who listen to the show. So can you explain how you use astrology in your life?
Yeah, I mean, I use astrology basically to help me think about whatever's going on in my life. I do also use it as a way to look forward and kind of think about what's coming in the future. Compared to other astrologers, I may not be as obsessed as some astrologer people I know that are constantly looking at their transits every single day. I may have something even sneak up on me. Like I just noticed coming here, because we were talking about Venus, I was like, oh, I should look at my Venus in secondary progressions, which is a timing technique. And I have an exact square, like to the minute this week, between my progressed Venus and my natal sun, which is something I could have seen coming for months and years even, and known it was right now. And I didn't really realize it until that it's actually happening right now, like the other day. So I'm not always like looking at everything, but I do tend to keep track of what's going on. I'll use it also for sometimes choosing a good moment to do something or launch something. And I think I've always used it the most for reflecting about my experiences, about what's going on, and learning more about myself is really the primary thing that I use it for, though.
Awesome. Amazing. Okay. So we will jump right into it then. So let's talk about the Venus retrograde in Aries, and what are some key dates that we can pay attention to during this retrograde? I know it starts March 1st.
Yeah, so Venus retrograde is a huge topic, and it's hugely significant, and it's really, in the art of astrology, one of the most ancient, important, cross-culturally around the planet Earth transits and cycles of everything. So, and although Venus is technically stationing retrograde on March 1st, we are already in this Venus phase where a lot of stuff is already coming up, and all the storylines that will be intensifying with more changes would already be starting to come up for you right now. So, and that's because of numerous reasons. I guess one of the things about just speaking of how ancient this is, so, there's a Roman goddess Venus, and there's the Greek goddess Aphrodite, but she's also really the great goddess. And in ancient Mesopotamia and Babylon, there's like Ishtar and Inanna. And if you go back to the oldest like cuneiform tablets that we have, they are marking the Venus cycle. So similar to eclipses and the long history of eclipses being tracked and how huge that is with changes going on in people's lives and changes going on in the world, the Venus cycle has also been tracked. And a lot of you probably know that the astrology of 2025, many people are saying how this is going to be like a new era, and all these outer planets are changing signs right now. The Venus cycle, and paying attention to Venus retrograde cycles, is also this great pattern maker across time in history. In fact, if anybody ever watches the astrology podcast with Chris Brennan, and Nick Dagan-Best just did like a 7-hour episode or something like that, just about historical patterns on this one particular Venus retrograde point. Not even all Venus retrograde, just Venus retrograde in Aries. So it's a huge deal. And because this particular Venus retrograde cycle is timed with these outer planets changing, and as we'll talk about, one of the key passages of the Venus retrograde cycle, it's very liminal when Venus kind of goes down into the underworld and she disappears. That's all happening in between eclipses. So we get these very powerful eclipses coming in. We get Neptune entering Aries for the first time since the 1860s, and Venus moving back and forth across Neptune. As that's happening, we have the Neptune-Saturn cycle coming to an end, which is hugely important, and Venus is moving back and forth, connecting them. The eclipses are setting off Venus and Neptune, Saturn and Neptune. She's also moving through aspects with Pluto and Aquarius back and forth. She's also moving back and forth through aspects with Uranus and Taurus. So there's just tons of stuff going on with this, where we, as astrologers, people for a long time have wondered about March and April just being very chaotic, very volatile, great changes happening. And I think you can already feel how that's going on in the world right now as we're starting to approach it. And so if you go outside right now, you can see Venus very bright as an evening star. So one of the things about Venus is she is the brightest star She is at like that classic, like go out and wish upon a star. And what's happening now is she's getting brighter and brighter and brighter, and she's coming closer and closer and closer to us. So her influence is intensifying in the world and for all of us. And she's going to continue to get brighter as we come into the upcoming full moon in the middle of February. And that's one of the key things. She won't disappear from view until much later in March. But what essentially happens over the Venus retrograde phase is she goes from being this bright evening star to then descending, and then she disappears, and then she emerges as this like bright flash of light, rising up as this morning star. And so that's a big another thing about it, this big transition that she goes through as part of it. That's a really big deal. Yeah.
Definitely. And, what you said, there is a lot going on in March and April. So just for the listeners, maybe we should give some dates so they know, and this is all starting to happen. So, we are feeling the Venus retrograde right now. We're feeling everything. I don't even know, brewing.
Yeah, things are definitely brewing.
Yeah. And March 1st is actually when Venus stations retrograde. And that's until April 13th.
Yeah. Basically. That's when
Okay.
she stations direct.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then we talked a lot about, before we started recording, the eclipses and also Neptune's ingress to Aries. So we have the eclipses on the 29th
Yes.
of March.
There's a solar eclipse on March 29th. So one thing that's important about that solar eclipse, which will connect to the Venus retrograde, is Venus stations around 10 degrees of Aries. So if you have anything around 10 degrees of Aries, Libra, Cancer, Capricorn especially, or I guess things that make aspects to that degree, that eclipse is also basically going to be pretty much at 10 Aries. So the Venus stations at the beginning of March there, and at the end of March, we get an eclipse, basically the same place that she stationed retrograde at. And actually in between, Mercury also stations retrograde right there, because the thing that's also happening is Mercury is also retrograde at the same time Venus is retrograde, at the same time as these eclipses. And both Venus and Mercury are retrograde, moving back and forth across Neptune, as Neptune also goes into Aries at the end of March. It's
on
really
March 30th.
March 30th.
Yeah.
So Neptune goes into Aries right after that eclipse.
Yeah.
So it's a really big deal. Yeah.
It is a huge deal. So there's a lot going on. Let's start from the beginning. So what are some key themes for this Venus retrograde? And in general, what do you think are key themes when Venus stations retrograde and goes retrograde?
Yeah. So, Venus, she is the goddess of love, and the planet is also very associated with love and oftentimes harmony, what we find desirable and pleasurable, what we desire in relationship, the kind of relationships we want, what we want to attract in our life, all these sort of underlying values and aesthetics and style and taste we have that goes into what we desire and want to attract into our life. Venus also, in the way she can really harmonize and bring things together, she's very much about creativity and our creative expression in the world. And normally we think about Venus often as maybe soothing something or bringing things together in her transits. So one thing that is different when Venus goes retrograde is we can get a big pattern breaker around a lot of this. And we might start questioning what we desire or what we want in our relationship, or our style might start changing, or our tastes might start changing, or whatever it is. And there might start being a breakdown or a dissonance in some of that, and then a rearranging of what it is we want and desire, but it's also just an extreme intensification of Venus, because what's happening, as I mentioned, is she's getting closer and closer to us. She's not really going retrograde. she's actually making a big loop in the sky. And because Venus orbits in between us and the sun, she's basically coming in between our orbit on Earth with the sun and then lining up like right in between us. That will happen on March 22nd. So there's sort of from March 1st to March 22nd, there is this kind of burning up, getting closer and closer to the sun, and maybe a sense of something changing, but it can also be wildly creative. And I do think one thing to keep in mind with this retrograde and all the things that are going to be changing in the world is try to not get too caught up in fear and anxieties, and try to embrace all the change, and that this can really be a wildly creative and innovative time that can really open up new potentials and possibilities at the same time. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we were talking a little bit about it when Venus is retrograde in Aries. There is this like burning down to the core, right? So it's, well, first let's start here. We got to be a part of Marcella Kroll's timeline jump workshop last night, and that was really great. And it's interesting, we're saying how this ties into Venus retrograde in Aries, because the timeline jump workshop was us now, so who we are at this moment in time. And we went into a meditation where we let go and strip down of everything that we don't want to take with us to our future self. And we see our future self in this meditation, which I think is very symbolic of a Venus retrograde, because we are getting rid of, burning down values that don't align, maybe even an identity that doesn't align with us anymore. And we're able to get to a new space with time and work. So, yeah.
Yeah, one of the things, the way she wanted us to focus on how are we still, even if we want this change or we want to do the timeline jumping, like you're saying, there might be ways we're still attached to the old timeline, or how we used to be, or old fears we have, or old perceptions we have about ourselves. And so that quality of letting go of those types of things is very powerful from now all the way up to that, especially up to that March 22nd time of Venus coming into conjunction with the sun, which will also be when all these eclipses are happening. So that's a great time to look at what you want to let go of and release, and start embracing like a new direction.
Absolutely. Yes. So those are some key themes for the Venus retrograde. And just Venus in general, we were talking about the golden mean a little bit and how that all ties in. And Venus, like as a 5-pointed star, like the number 5. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's a really interesting point, just to bring all of this together.
Yeah, so when I was mentioning earlier about it being this ancient timekeeping system, if you're aware of the Mayan culture and the Mayan calendar, and how everyone says the Mayans really had the most accurate calendar, that was based on the Venus cycle. And we know Venus has been tracked for a really long time. And so she has an 8-year cycle where within 8 years, she will have 5 retrograde phases, and 5 times that she'll be retrograde conjunct the sun from our perspective, which is that point where she's like in between us and the sun. And those 5 points that she does that within every 8 years, if you write them down in a circle, it creates a 5-pointed star or a rose. And so all of the symbology of the rose or any 5-petaled flower or form, and how we associate that with Venus or love or beauty, is because that is actually the Venus cycle. And even that just 5-pointed star symbol we have is, again, it's literally the Venus cycle. Because she orbits in between us and the sun, she has a conjunction in between us and the sun when she's retrograde, and then also when she's as far away from possible on the other side of the sun from us. And she also has 5 of those every 8 years. That also forms a 5-pointed star, but we can just talk about the retrograde one. And if you divide 8 by 5, it's 1.6. 1.6 is related to the golden mean and that Fibonacci sequence of numbers. It's a form that's just, people have found it seems like it's part of God or goddesses, divine creation. It's in nautilus shells. Our human bodies are proportionally aligned with it. If you've ever studied Leonardo da Vinci or all those famous painters, they were painting with the golden mean. The Parthenon and many ancient sacred sites around the world were constructed with the golden mean and that golden ratio with how the buildings were formed. I was sharing because you were saying you play piano. In Ariel Gutman is an astrologer that really brought all of this forward with her book Venus Star Rising, and that's a book I would really recommend if you're interested in this. And in Ariel's book Venus Star Rising, she mentions how with a piano, even within an octave, I guess there are 13 keys and 8 are white and 5 are black. Mm-hmm. So even the piano itself has this resonance with the actual Venus cycle, apparently.
Yeah, and that's amazing because, when we think about music, we're thinking about harmony, right? And we're thinking about a frequency that music gives to us in order to evoke a certain emotion. And when we think about this in the way of a retrograde, there's like a dissonance to the chords in a way, where if it were direct, there's a consonance. And so it's almost like with Venus retrograde, there needs to be a little bit of a friction or dissonance. I don't know if dissatisfaction would be the right word, but something needs to rub together in order to provoke and move forward, especially when we're talking about Venus and Aries, because Aries is the warrior and there's a lot of energy. It's, we related to the planet of Mars, and there's action, determination, moving forward, rallying together. There's a lot of that energy when it comes to Mars. So I think that really does tie into this Venus retrograde now. And that's such a great example, by the way. So thank you.
About the
golden meme. Yeah, that was great. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And so relate to what you're saying with Mars and this month ahead in February, that's going to be a really big factor because, so we're talking today on February 2nd. So yesterday on February 1st, that was an important day because Venus was in Pisces and she was just forming a conjunction with Neptune and the north node of the moon in Pisces. And that's part of the configuration that she's going to come back and forth across. So that's one of the reasons why we're already starting to get a lot of these themes picked up, as well as back a little while ago on January 18th, she formed a conjunction with Saturn in Pisces, and she's also going to come back and forth forming conjunctions with Saturn. But in just a few days, just a couple of days, on February 4th, she's going to enter Aries. So what's important about her entering Aries, that is the sign opposite from her home sign of Libra. And that's a big contrast to Pisces, where she's actually exalted. So we sort of have this exalted status and expression of Venus in Pisces. And then she moves into this place where it's as far away from her home as she can be. And that does tend to, it can go with some countercultural things and a different type of, can be a little bit more of a wild card. Venus things tend to move faster in an Aries way. It is important though that she's right now this bright evening star though, which is going to tend to be, that's more of the, as Ariel Gutman talks about in her book, that's more of like the lover side of the Venus and more of the imaginative side of the phase and a little bit more otherworldly and yearning. So there's going to be a lot of that kind of real passionate yearning, I think. And I think with all the changes going on in the world and people maybe wanting to rally people together, to bring people together to do something, or just however you want to change your life, that's going to be really going on. But it's going to be very extreme because she's going to move into the sign of Mars. And Mars is retrograde right now in Cancer. So Mars is also in this very extreme phase, which is this real pattern breaking phase that tends to also bring disruption, but Mars retrograde can also just bring great dramatic changes that can honestly end up being very exciting for people. Some people tend to work with Mars retrograde differently from person to person, but both Mars retrograde and Venus retrograde can be great, just pattern breakers, change agents. If you want to change your life and do something different, it's a great time to do that. And so there's a wild combination that this month, Venus is going to get closer and closer to stationing, and Mars is retrograde. And by the time we get to the end of February, actually, especially at the full moon coming up, so the full moon coming up in Leo, which is going to be a very dramatic full moon because it's in Leo. It is clashing with Uranus and Taurus. It's really activating Uranus. So it's going to have this very Uranian kind of breakout quality. And once we hit that full moon, even though Mars doesn't actually station direct until February 23rd, and Venus doesn't actually station retrograde until March 1st, they're not really moving. And so they're both going to basically Venus will be kind of hovering around 10 degrees of Aries, and Mars will be hovering around 17 degrees of Cancer. And then when we get to the new moon in Pisces at the end of February, Mars will be officially direct, but not really moving. And Venus will be about to station retrograde, but again, not really moving. And so there's this really fascinating, something is just getting really intensified. And because Venus is in the sign of Mars, that movement of Mars being retrograde and stationing at the end of February is just going to intensify something that is going to be really even more catalytic than we normally get. We sometimes will get this where we go from one Mars retrograde into a Venus retrograde. It doesn't happen all the time, but what's even more powerful about this transition is just that Venus is in the sign of Mars, if that makes sense to people. So there very well likely could be, we can already see there's big current events going on already, but there could very well be some very dramatic things happening, towards the end of February that then, because usually Mars stations direct and something gets really mobilized to like some martial force erupts out of that going direct. But that eruption of Mars is launching us into this Venus retrograde. So yeah, that's just why it's really unpredictable what will happen, but we just know if you want to make a change and like do the timeline jumping like you were referencing, like this is it.
Yeah.
And because systems are going to be breaking down and we don't really know what's going to be going on with it, I think one thing that's powerful about that, which we were just talking about too, is that if you have this sort of sense of a false self or a way you've tried to fit into the different systems in the world, which often have a lot of systematic oppression embedded in them anyway, whether that's through patriarchy or racism or sexism or whatever it is. We were talking a little bit before. A powerful thinker for me at this time is Bell Hooks, because Bell Hooks was born in 1952. She was born at the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Libra. So she has Saturn-Neptune. Her chart's very Saturn-Neptune. She has a bunch of stuff in Libra. And her book, All About Love, I think is very resonant for what's going on in the world. And one thing she talks about in that book is shedding this notion of the false self and the way we've kind of tried to fit ourselves into these systems, where that's to make money or be involved in whatever it is. And if we can do that and then kind of use it to connect back to what we truly desire. because things are going to be falling apart around us anyway in some ways. Some people's jobs. So let's say you work in the United States for a federal government agency that might be under threat right now that you thought was this secure job.
Yeah.
That could just be, as an example, possibly taken away from somebody, or they're not sure they can count on it anymore. It's no longer this stable thing to fit into. So that's where, whatever it is for you, it's like, how do you just embrace the possibility? Because the possibility, we're also talking about eclipses and this kind of void, and that things can really dramatically change. So that's, if that makes sense, there is possibility and potential there.
Yeah.
To try to move with it and just embrace what can happen.
100%. And, in those cases where people are losing what provides livelihood, and brings them income, where they feel like they were secure in a certain space, but now they're not, there is a beauty about a Venus retrograde and the whole desire piece, right? So it's like, hey, what do you really desire without society, right? What do you really desire that has not been made for you, but it actually comes from your values. It actually comes from the heart. It comes from your true Aries identity and self. So how can you rebuild that? And, in our society, it's interesting because a lot of people are much more entrepreneurial than they've ever been. And there are like jobs. I don't even want to call it jobs. It's like people's life work, right? It's the reason they're here, and they're able to do their life work and make a living. And I'm seeing that more and more. The World Wide Web has been a huge player in that, a key player in being able to promote people's craft, people's work, and Instagram, social media, TikTok, all of that as well. So while it may feel honestly devastating to some people to lose these things, there is a way to rebuild. And I think Mars retrogrades can be really potent and a really good ally for these times, and help people to get to the place they want to be. It's like that extra push. And again, with retrogrades, sometimes it's that discord and the reevaluation that helps you to get to where you really need to be. So, and I love the bell hooks reference. I actually have the book here, and we were talking about this a while ago, but aside from what you had mentioned about bell hooks, I think there's also unwiring of like the masculine and the feminine that she really talks about in her book. And I think that's really important at this time because actually I'll read this really quick. It's just like a small little quote, but bell hooks says, most men feel that they receive love and therefore know what it feels like to be loved. Women often feel we are in a constant state of yearning, wanting love, but not receiving it. And I read that and I just felt like it was so Venus retrograde and Mars retrograde. And then it spoke archetypically to the Venus archetype and the Mars archetype of masculine and feminine. I am hoping, and I think there's more space for men to feel love and be healed in this time that we're moving into. And I am seeing more blurring of gender identity, and that's wonderful because really I'm a believer that, like we really don't have to conform to that. But this book is so profound because, this is not a new book. Do you know when it was written?
Yeah, it came out around 99, I think, 98, 99, coming into 2000. But
yeah.
it came out around, it did roughly come out around, there was a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in 89, and then they came into a square in the late 90s, and that book sort of came out around that waxing square of Saturn-Neptune. That's one way that it fits into the cycle.
Yeah.
But with the Saturn-Neptune cycle ending now too, and we're coming to the end of that cycle, that really goes with the way reality just changes and the way we collectively perceive reality and all agree reality works. And with that reality changing on this really deep level, there's also the sense of, with the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, we're in this symbolic era of air now, which goes with Pluto being in Aquarius. And I mentioned Venus will be moving back and forth through sextile aspects with Pluto and Aquarius over the course of the retrograde. So I think that speaks to what you were saying up to about the technology making things possible for people to make changes in that way. So I think that's one of the empowering ways that you can use how do you use all these ways things are changing with reality to pursue more of what you really want to do. Saturn Neptune can also bring up pretty consistently themes of witch hunts, and people can get very persecutory about their ideals. People can get very idealistic, wanting to create their own ideals, but then also kind of project their ideals on other people and make them conform to their ideals. So anything, and Venus can go with women. Venus can go with trans people, queer people. And so all of those categories of people that could definitely get very energized and activated by the Venus retrograde. For this particular Venus retrograde in Aries, that's gone back, I think, since like 1905. There started being Venus-Sun conjunctions in Aries around 1929. There is a lot of history of particular women's rights and protests. That's one of the big historical patterns with this. And I think it's sort of that Venus and Aries, like taking action, making change. The last time we had one in 2017, because you can go, if you want to think about it, keep going 8 years back. So, because Venus every 8 years goes retrograde around the same date, around the same degree range. It's usually like 2 or 3 days difference and 2 or 3 degrees difference. So 2017, there was one. The same time period, 2009, there was one, 2001, 1993, and so on. 2017, there was the big, that was the last time Donald Trump was inaugurated, and there was a big women's protest march, for example. But there's just a lot of other examples of that going back through history. So I think that's something else we can probably see too is, depending what's going to happen, there'll probably be some important protests and people wanting to rebalance things in different ways as part of this.
Yeah, that's right. Definitely. And thinking about that, I can't believe that was in 2017. It seems like that just happened. But that was the Me Too movement, right? And it was...
Yeah, that had been happening around that time too. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So
I guess it came out around, I can't remember the dates of that exactly, but it was around that same time. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Yep. Yeah. And, with astrology, not that history repeats itself the same every single time, but, of course, like, as astrologers, we look for patterns and, patterns in time. And so what you said, we may see some protests, and just because Venus is associated with queer and trans folks, I think we could definitely see protests in that way, just especially with the political climate and what's happening right now, because there is so much restriction that's happening. So I definitely think that we're probably already seeing it, and maybe it's not even brought to the surface, or to social media surface or media surface. So,
yeah. And so there's just going to be this thing with idealism is just a really big theme. And with, like I'm saying, with the Saturn Neptune cycle coming to the end, when we do get to this ingress of Neptune going into Aries, I'm just really curious what will happen with that. We can imagine it's probably going to be a really incredibly idealistic time, and things are just moving a lot faster and a big quickening. And I keep thinking, especially around idealism, of people getting swept up into movements, it could be like wildfires being set off, and a real quickening. There's a real sense of being on a quest with Aries, and I think Venus in Aries, I have Venus in Aries actually in my chart. We can get very, if we are tested, or if we're going on a quest or something, we have to overcome something or need to take on the impossible task, we can get very inspired, and there's a lot of desire that can come up with that, I think, because of the combination of it being the home of Mars and exaltation of the sun. And so I do think there's going to be a lot of like people being rallied to different causes, and one of the big Aries myths is the golden fleece, and so there's all sorts of golden fleeces out there people might be going after and chasing. The last time Neptune went into Aries, a big deal was oil. That was like the first big oil boom, and that was also the Earth era of Jupiter, Saturn. Now we're in the air era, and there's all this other AI and whatever else, is going on. So we can see that clearly going on, but there's all sorts of ways that could be coming up. So one thing you mentioned that I think is important when we were talking earlier, you mentioned what kind of music you might be drawn to or kind of films. One thing about Neptune being so important during this time, and a combination of Saturn, Neptune, because they're ending their cycle, things are really dissolving and breaking down into this sort of solutio dissolution, especially as they're in Pisces right now. And with the Venus retrograde coming in at the same time activating them, I think it could be very confusing. And it's easy to say everybody's going to be and everybody's going to be in a delusion or in an illusion, and certainly many people are, and that's going to be going on. But one of the people that passed recently that I think was an important symbol for us is David Lynch, and he, with his passing, a lot of his words and teachings have just been like all over the place. And one of the things he would talk about is intuition being the most important tool we have, and how powerful our imagination is. Somebody else, there's a book called Air and Dreams by Gaston Bachelard, who's a famous French philosopher that I've been looking at. And he, in that book, talks a lot about how it's really our imagination and all the images we associate with our imagination. That's what really actually guides our experience. That imaginal dimension and our dream, it's really shapes how we perceive things and is really what guides us. So all this is going to be activated, and you might have old memories coming up, old fantasies coming up, old dreams coming up, yearning for new dreams coming up. I mean, it's all going to be mixed together in different kind of timelines, and it's going to be, I think, very non-linear. But if you, instead of just thinking, oh, I'm just in a fantasy, or I'm just in a dream, or I'm just daydreaming in my imagination, like think about what is coming up for you. What is a fantasy for you? What movies are you being drawn towards? What is the music that you're being drawn towards? And see if that can help sort of guide you into how your desires are changing and your creativity is changing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think that'll be really big with the combination of everything going on.
Absolutely. And, just with Neptune, like, what are your desires, and where do you uphold the boundary to your desires, and where can you break free of that boundary in order to make your desires a reality? And even with creativity, because if you are a creative and artist, a lot of us do have almost like a wall that we hit with our creativity, and we think that's as far as we can go, right? But pushing the bounds and pushing our, not limits, but what we think is actually possible, and getting to a different place. I think we're going to see a lot of innovation during this time, and it might be wild, honestly, like, whoa, who would have thought of that type stuff? But I think it's going to be interesting at the same time. And the boundary of consciousness and subconsciousness almost being blurred together, like
Yeah,
that
I think
dream.
so.
How do you make the dream a reality? I love what Rick Levine always says. He says that Neptune is the dream that creates the scaffolding. He's talking about Saturn, but for the reality to come through, and he's talking about Saturn. So basically, it's like, dream the dream, and that's actually the foundation. The dream is the foundation, and then Saturn just helps it to form into reality.
Yeah, there's a quote that I think Rick paraphrases from Rob Hand, which I'm not remembering exactly right now, but it's what you're just speaking to, and it's something along the line of that we think Saturn is reality, and a lot of times astrologers talk about Saturn being sort of our consensus idea of shared reality, but the more you look into quantum thinking and all the way things are changing, which will be changing even more. We see this a lot with Saturn, Neptune, but that Neptune is really more actual, the Saturn in that kind of a sense. I mean, one thing, I don't know if it'll happen this time, but the combination of where Pluto is in Aquarius with Neptune being in Aries, just that combination has gone with complete paradigms breaking, like the literal heliocentric revolution, and realizing we actually orbit around the sun. Our entire conception of the unit reality completely changing. And even this Venus retrograde cycle in Aries, I'm pretty sure one of Einstein's big, like his wonder year of all his big breakthroughs came in like the first one.
Oh,
The
fascinating.
1917 Saturn Neptune was when he took his theories of relativity to like the bigger picture of everything. So there's ways where like even our conception of reality could really end up dramatically changing with the way science and different things come together. So yeah, we really need to embrace the imagination, and we're going to need. I think we're going to with the North Node in Pisces as part of all of this. We actually are going to need to rely on our intuition and our imagination, I think, to guide us through this. We're going to have to draw on that inner sense of knowing that we have within us to guide us through, because what we maybe thought used to be reliable and stable isn't so much anymore. And even though people will talk about Neptune being illusory and Saturn being reality, Saturn actually has traditional associations with deception and dishonesty, because Saturn's actually very it's often got two extremes, like really people that are struggling with money and people that are really wealthy, and it can be honest, it can be dishonest, and people will think they know reality. It's like their sense of Saturn, and they project that on other people, and they can be really persecute other people, and they're actually in a total illusion. So that sense of Saturn is being dissolved right now, and we're in this mix where it's just going to be really chaotic, but something's going to emerge out of that, and we really need to go all in on, what do you really want to create and get. So that's what I would recommend in February, is try to get more clear about what do you want to create, what do you really desire. And it can be a really wildly creative time. I mean, the thing is, the creative potential and the ideas that can come in over the next 3 months are just, it's off the charts.
Yeah.
You couldn't really ask for a more potentially creatively exciting time. It's going to unfortunately be really terrible with some news events, but it's going to be also just really dramatic. And it also means you can have great creative breakthroughs. It just all kind of goes together.
Yeah, definitely. And, like with all of that, letting go of what is in the way of that creativity, like really intentionally shedding it and letting it go, because creativity, it is vulnerability, right? When we're truly in our creative flow, we are expressing ourselves in a way that is so raw and so pure and truly comes from the heart. So sometimes with Saturn, it does feel restrictive, like bound, you can't move forward. So being able to let all of that go and move forward with this wild creativity. And yeah, I think you're right. We're going to see just, as a collective, I don't want to say devastating, but news that is hard for us to imagine. And like even news where we're like, how would anyone ever think this is okay? But then the flip side of that is, well, hey, how do we start over? How do we start from scratch? It's almost like a new recipe that is wanting to come through. So yeah, definitely through February, getting imaginative, getting creative, and going through the beginning of March, really embracing that personally and collectively.
Yeah, and if it looks like there's always obvious signs with like the recent presidential inauguration and all these plutocrat billionaires like sitting in the front row.
Yeah.
If it does keep going with this mass transfer of wealth, what happens very consistently with Saturn Neptune is things go down and there's a great overturning. And what drives people is economic uncertainty and people not having enough, and people actually lose it and they revolt. And one of the time periods that has the greatest number of corresponding cycles all happening at the same time as right now is basically the Protestant Reformation and going through the Peasants' Revolt in like 1524 into the 1530s when we had Pluto in Aquarius and Neptune in Aries. And that was when like Henry VIII keeps marrying people, but he's also breaking with the Church of England. Breaking with Catholicism. And so we basically have the overturning of, not to put people down with Catholicism, because Catholicism is amazing as a religion and a spiritual practice and ritual, but just at that time period, the amount of power they had, we can't really, it's hard for us to imagine now. And that was basically overturned at that time period. And then later, when we get to another period that goes into other time periods, like especially coming into the Neptune and there's another period where a lot of similar overlaps where monarchy starts falling apart, and right now we have this big rise of the plutocratic wealthy class that's really like in power. So if we look at who's set up to have a big revolution, like take it down, to me that's most likely who it is, but we also don't know how it's all going to play out. I mean, there's something obviously going on where people are really potentially being empowered with more tools in their hands, but then there's also, we've never really been in such a complete surveillance state either.
Yeah.
Where everybody's being constantly tracked and having all their data taken from them. So like it's just a weird mix. But what we have seen very consistently is things do change, and what you thought was so powerful and could never fall does. And so there could be really some dramatic things that go down.
Absolutely. And with these outer planets, it's like these, I want to call them key players, right? All bringing this different type of energy to this moment this year. And what you said, there's a lot of surveillance, yeah, but there's also this energy of like people rising up and owning their power. And I've already seen the breakthroughs where our society thinks that they can only go so far with certain rules, regulations, policies, whatever it may be, and then they kind of push that. I mean, this is such a weird example, but I had to run to Target yesterday, and there was this guy who was stealing, and LP came and caught him, and he videotaped, or not videotaped, hello, I was born in 1979. He had his phone and he took a video of the LP guy, and the person stealing actually was like, I have you on video and I'm going to get you in trouble for talking to me the way that you did. So it was like a flip, right? And we're seeing a lot of like empowerment from people to big corporations, government. And this is definitely not Venus retrograde, but it could be, I guess, a little bit. But we're seeing a lot of like a rise from just people, normal people who...
Well, that will go with Venus. That's Venus retrograde. That's the kind of thing that will happen with...
I was thinking Pluto kind of too.
It does go with
like
Pluto
and Aquarius.
Yep, it does.
Yeah.
But it goes with Venus retrograde too. And since the Venus retrograde was sextile Pluto and Aquarius, that's going to get intensified. And Neptune and Aries can honestly throw lighter fluid on, the fire. Like it's just can ignite stuff even more.
Yeah.
So, it definitely could happen.
Yeah. So collectively, that's something that we're seeing. And we talked a lot about what people can do personally, like letting the old dissolve, bringing in the new, bringing in their creativity. One thing I was thinking too with Venus retrograde is a lot of times people from our past come back, and we'll see that. And I think it's interesting with Neptune moving into Aries also. So it's like, I wonder if people from people's past will come back, but also maybe like, in such a surprising way that they, never would have thought. And so I'm waiting for those stories to kind of arise as well.
Yeah, that can happen, I guess, with both Mars retrograde and Venus retrograde and Mercury retrograde, which are basically all going to be happening.
Yeah, that's true.
At the same time.
Yeah.
And I guess one thing about that too is, just again, think about what is that showing you? Because a lot of times, typically it doesn't work out. People come back and like what was happened in the past is like reestablished or anything, but it's going to be giving you some kind of important memory, some kind of important part of yourself you're reconnecting with, that maybe there's something about that needs to be brought back in again to be part of who you are. It's going to be, maybe think about what's the deeper message here for me. Definitely powerful things involving memory, I think for sure will be coming up with all the different retrogrades happening and eclipses and
absolutely. And a lot of times people from the past remind us, of course, of an old version of ourselves, or maybe who we were at our core at that time. And if there is a piece of that that has been masked or, like you said, forgotten, that will come back, and maybe we need to remember that in order to move forward. Society's just gotten busier over the last 10 years, and I think people are busier and they have to be in order to keep up. They don't have to be, but a lot of people think they have to be in order to keep up. So just remembering who we really are without having to rush through day to day, that's going to be important.
Yeah. And one thing, when you brought up the Bell Hooks All About Love book, it makes me think about too, as far as guidance, there's a, what is it from? I think it's from the book, The Road Less Traveled is it Gregory Peck? There's this quote she builds a lot of the book around where she talks about the importance of defining love. And I can't remember the exact quote, but it has something to do with the effect of sort of like spiritual growth and love being honoring not only your own spiritual growth and development, but your partners or anybody that you're in relationship with, because we're all collectively going to be moving through this, and we're all going to be going through our own individual changes and transmutations. And some people, are going to probably be doing something like, what is happening to that person? They seem to be doing something wildly different. We're all going to be going through this in different ways. And so I think being able to honor the space and growth of everybody that you're in relationship with, I think it's going to be really important.
Yeah, that is so important. And, sometimes as humans, I think there's a selfishness around our relationships where we want people to stay the same because
Right.
that's that comfortability piece. So we feel more comfortable with them when they are a certain way because we like to relate to them in that way. And then when we go through flux as humans, it's like, wait a minute, like, are we still friends? What's going on? And you just have to find a new way to relate. Maybe even a new way to have dialogue, or it could be anything. I know I'm experiencing this with one of my friends right now, and it's really fascinating. So our lives are changing quite a bit, and we still love each other so much, but we are loving each other in different ways and seeing our light in different ways. And that's so important to honor and to remember that you don't get someone as a comfort blanket for the rest of your life,
And sometimes with something like this, well, not everybody there's people you have to work with or be around all the time, but
Sure.
even in that situation, you can still give people space. And in some cases, if it's somebody you may not even see, you're like, oh, I'm not talking, like maybe you just need certain friends or relationships just have to like kind of let each of you go through your own thing. You might still come back together at the end of the process and find a way to reconnect with how each of you have changed. So I think there'd be a real wide variety. Like there could be some people kind of dropping out for a time and coming back, and then people you're more into daily contact with, you're just kind of letting each other change as you need to. But yeah, it's definitely, you can't expect, nothing's going to be changing. Like one thing is you can't, so a problem with Saturn, Neptune can be yearning for this golden age, yearning for this past ideal, make America great again, make America like 1953 when we had a Saturn Neptune conjunction and the CIA was giving LSD to everybody to brainwash them with MK Ultra. And we get the television era coming up and all this propaganda on television happening. That was a previous Saturn Neptune time. And or like make America like the late 80s. That was amazing when Donald Trump was the cool billionaire guy and Ronald Reagan was the president, and we went from Reagan to Bush in 89, and the Soviet Union collapses and America won. That was the last Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So people in a Saturn-Neptune, they can want things to go, because they're so uncertain, they want to go back to some lost thing that's not even, it's a fantasy. And with Neptune in Aries, a downside too, which will go with Saturn in Aries too, and the Venus retrograde in Aries, we have to keep in mind too, this is the exaltation of the sun. So we can exalt the sun, we can exalt the authority. People want to give some authority person, in the case in America, there's like Donald Trump, like give him all the power, let him to take this extreme authority power. We don't know they're looking for an authority. They're looking for somebody to give stuff over to. Like Henry VIII, who back in the Protestant Reformation, he threw off the Catholic Church, but he took incredible power as a king simultaneously. So we have to embrace the fact that things are going to be changing. We're all going to be changing. And it's like, how do you really embrace that and love one another through that change? And I think that's also why the Bell Hooks book I really like for this time, because it's all about, I think, really embracing that force of love. Because if you are embracing love and you're being love and expressing love, love also naturally sort of dissolves fear. And you can't really have the two at this, we're all going to need that at this time, because that's what we can really take us through any great change and transition.
Absolutely. And, even love outward and love inward. So love for ourselves, because you cannot create any sort of abundance if you have a fear-based mentality. And hopefully right now we're able to create abundance for ourselves and therefore create abundance and love for our community, because it really does start with ourselves. So that's important. And Aries is, like the identity, it's singular. And I think starting inward and then going outward with everything is a really good point. And Yeah, this book does speak to all of that. We could probably record a whole episode on this book and how it relates, but those are some good key points.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Amazing. So we talked a lot about how the Venus retrograde can help with our own personal development, our collective. We talked about some historical events and just how this ties into everything else that's going on. Is there anything else you wanted to touch upon?
I mean, yeah, I think that's all really good. Just to keep in mind that March will be really hectic. And if you think about when I mentioned before the period of the real liminality where Venus kind of goes under the underworld, we can't see her. It's not exact, but it's very roughly lining up with, there's a very powerful lunar eclipse in Virgo around March 14th that sets off the Saturn-Neptune. That's around the same time. It's not too long after that she's going to be disappearing. And then when we get that next solar eclipse in Aries at the end of March, she'll be reappearing right around that time, and something's being born out of that. And she's also then March 27th moving back across Neptune as Neptune's moving into Aries. So then there's something that really gets launched out of that, and April will really be adjusting to the way things have really dramatically changed. So like it's too hard to even, I think, know what's going to all be happening by then.
Yeah.
So right now is really just a time to like, yeah, just kind of center into how things are starting to already change for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's the year of the snake. So really allowing yourself to...
It's the shedding right now,
Yeah, shed, molt. Because if you don't molt, like I say this all the time with my clients who are going through really big change, but you know, a snake can get very sick or die if they don't molt. And so let what no longer serves you wash away from you. Let the skin come off, go. You know, it's really that time to embrace this change, and you can't move forward unless you get rid of what is holding you back. So that's really important. All right. Well, Gray, just a couple questions for you before we end. So I love books. I love to read, and I always like to ask astrologers and people on the show, what are you reading right now?
Well, one book I would recommend is that Air and Dreams by Gaston Bachelard. I don't know how to say his name exactly, but Bachelard. Yeah, he's French. He's a French philosopher. Persephone's Revolution by Rosie Finn is a book. I didn't want to work that into this talk because it gets really complicated, but she was my first astrology teacher. And it's a book on the declination cycle of Pluto and how Pluto is going extreme out of bounds right now in Aquarius. And it really recontextualizes all of the astrology going on in pretty powerful ways. If you check out my YouTube channel, I did an interview of her talking about Persephone's Revolution, the book there. And if you could watch that and see if it's interesting to you. But that book I've been reading, it's really interesting. I've been reading The Moment of Astrology by Jeffrey Cornelius, which is cool. Which is a really classic astrology book about divination.
Yeah.
See 5. The Order Disorder Paradox by Nathan Schwartz-Salant. He was a Jungian therapist, and that book's also about disorder and order, and how we go through our relation, there's like a dance with disorder and order, and when there's disorder, a new orders are emerging, or if we have an event psychologically that sort of creates a new order, we naturally swing to disorder, but there's a creative tension there to work out that I think is also very relevant for right now. So
relevant with the retrograde.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Yeah, amazing. You're reading, what was the astrology book you're reading?
Persephone's Revolution by Rosie Finn.
Okay, cool. And that's from your astrology teacher?
She was my first astrology teacher,
and that's the YouTube video?
Yeah, there's a YouTube video on my YouTube channel where you can, I interview her.
Okay, yeah.
I would say too, Venus Star Rising by Ariel Gutman. If y'all haven't read that, that's she wrote a whole book about the Venus star point. So if you're interested in that, and you can also learn about, she makes a big deal about the Venus star point that was while you were in the womb, before you were born. That's actually, it's a really interesting idea.
Yeah.
That you can also look at. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, so another question for you before we close out. If you could time travel, which maybe we can, right? Maybe we already are. But if you could time travel maybe to 2034,
wow,
how will you be using astrology? What do you think astrology will be then? How do you think the community will be? How do you think we'll be using it as astrologers? If you have an answer to that.
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I would imagine it's very different with the technology in some kind of way, but
yeah.
I hope I'm using it in the most fulfilling life I've ever lived. And yeah, I think there's all sorts of things that it would be hard for me to know. I feel like there are probably very incredibly innovative ways to relate to it based upon all the different technology that'll be changing. But I also hope, however that is, that it's not just like a virtual simulation, and that it also involves like being out in the world, and this like, relationship with this, however that is, like facilitates like being in a relationship with the actual sky. And not a computer program, but but I think there'll probably be something just really mind-blowing that happened with technology too, that it's hard to know what that would be.
Yeah, I am not quite sure, but I'm excited. I do hope that it's still very real. I really am hoping for, I think in person, like it can't all be technology.
No.
We have to be able to connect to people, energy in the sky. I think that's so important. So yeah, we'll see what happens. Okay, so does anyone in the audience have a question or anything they want to ask about the podcast, about anything we talked about? Any comments? Sort of. Oh, okay. So
keep it off the record. Yeah.
Okay, maybe then we'll just close out, and that can come afterwards. So, Gray, I know you talked about your website a little bit in the beginning, but if someone wanted to book a reading with you or work with you or learn from you, where can they find you?
Yeah, my website is graycrawford.net, and you can find links to book a consult with me. Anybody here, I can give you a business card too if you want one. And on YouTube, it's Gray Crawford Astrology, which I think is also my Instagram. So those are all places. But if you go to my website, graycrawford.net, you can find all the info you want there.
Amazing. And is there anything specific you're working on right now that you want to share with us?
Well, for those of you here, I am going to be at the Tucson Astrologers Guild this next weekend. On Friday, I'm going to do a talk on Saturn, Neptune, and on Saturday, I'm going to do a workshop on Mercury and secondary progressions, in which you'll actually learn about the Mercury cycle. We were talking about the Venus cycle today, but we'll on that day talk about the Mercury cycle and how that plays out in secondary progressions, creating like chapters in your life story using that Mercury cycle. I also have a course, like I mentioned, called Triton's Cave, and it's about the Saturn-Neptune cycle. And actually everything that we talked about tonight, I keep saying tonight, but it's today. I don't know why I keep saying tonight.
Well, we were talking last night too, so yeah,
but,
maybe, I don't know.
I'm timeline jumping myself.
Yeah.
But in fact, the Bell Hooks book I'm going to recommend. What's that? It starts on February 23rd, and it goes from February 23rd until March 23rd. It'll be on Sundays about 10 a.m. in Pacific time starting. But there'll also be some extra information. And actually, I'm going to suggest people read the Bell Hooks book as part of that and work that in, have it be a space where people can share about their lives and experiences and relate to what's going on with all this wild astrology happening the next couple of months.
Awesome. And then people can sign up for your course on your website.
On my
correct?
website, yep.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Okay.
Later in the year, I guess something else in October, there's going to be the first ever Living Astrologies conference that my friend Jason Hawley is organizing. That's going to be October 2nd to October 5th in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And that will actually be, like what you were just describing, a much more embodied, experiential astrology conference. There, I need to put a link to that on my site, but if you look up Living Astrologies Conference, you would find it. And for example, there won't be PowerPoints, and all the workshops are going to be some form of experiential connection. Cameron Allen, who you've had here before, he will be there too. So as well as myself, but yeah.
Beautiful. That sounds amazing. And I'll put a link to all of that in the show notes in case any of you are interested. All right. And as for me, I'm here at COSME. We have, 4 sound baths coming up in February. If you're interested, that will be myself and Nadia Diaz facilitating. You can go to my website or my Instagram at cosmeastrology.com and you can book there. What else do we have going on this month? We have one more podcast, which I will announce later. And then we have a couple astrology workshops, which will also be on my website. So I'm really excited for that. And that's it. I'm seeing new clients if anyone's interested. And you said you are taking on new clients as well. Yeah. Okay, that's great. So thank you all for being here today. Thanks for joining us in the crowd. And we will see you next time.